The Writer's Dream. I'm Linda Maria Frank, the author of Annie Tillery Mystery Series and the host and the producer of the show. The Writer's Dream airs on Cablevision, Channel 20. Please consult your program guide in your local area to find out when it does. It also airs here from East Hampton, from LTV. Look on their website, ltveh.org, to see what their program guide tells you about how many times we're seen. I think we're seen 4 times a week here. My email will scroll across the screen every once in a while, and if you are a published author and interested in doing the show, please contact me. We have a Facebook page called The Writer's Dream, and we are on a YouTube channel called, guess what? The Writer's Dream. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guests, Matt Pasca and Terri Pasca. They are a married couple, and they are both poets. I have some information about Matt, and then I'm going to read his, and then Terri's going to tell you all about herself. So Matt teaches in Bayshore High School. He teaches creative writing, mythology, and literature. He was named New York State Teacher of Excellence in 2003, and as an educator, I really respect you for that, because I know how much hard work goes into that. He's the advisor of the Writer's Block, named Most Outstanding High School Literary Arts Magazine for 2010 by the American Scholastic Press Association. His poetry has appeared in Long Island Quarterly, the Pedestal Magazine, and J.B. Stillwater's online literary journal. And I think he's on the way to becoming the Poet Laureate of Nassau County. Terri, tell us about yourself.
I'm Terri Muusa, and I started out as an actress and director, and then a teacher, and then I got my social work degree, so I'm also a social worker, a licensed social worker, certified self-defense instructor, and also a writer and a poet.
One-stop shopping.
Yes, I do many things. I wear many hats. And I'm currently the communications coordinator for the Bayshore School District, so I do all their PR for the school.
Excellent.
So I make sure that teachers like Matt get the credit they deserve.
That's wonderful.
For the work that they do.
And you both have written poetry. Matt's is 1,000 Doors, and Terri's is Overexposed.
Yes.
Both poetry. Now, I have to ask you about poetry, okay? Because I am a prose writer, and I've never even attempted. As I was telling Matt and Terri before, I'm music challenged, so I must be poetry challenged too. I did a reading at the gazebo in Oceanside. If you don't know about the gazebo in Oceanside, please look up summer readings in the gazebo at Oceanside online. It's a wonderful program. They do it every Monday evening. Matt's read there. I read there about a week ago, and I was the ragweed in the rose patch because I was the prose writer amongst all of these poets. And as I was listening to the poetry, I was thinking to myself, I really don't understand poetry. So I want you to explain poetry to me. What is the difference between my telling a story in prose and my telling a story in poetry?
I think the biggest difference between prose and poetry is poetry distills a truth down to the smallest amount of words, into a stillness. I think you have more expansiveness, or more words, or more pages, or more room, or more breadth when you're writing in prose. Poetry tries to get at the truth without anything else in the way. And just
more emotional? Would you say it's more emotional?
More condensed, more intense, I think. And I think just like modern art, where what's left out is as important as what's included. Where the white spaces on the canvas are as important as the color. Poetry kind of leaves space and breath, and it uses line breaks and meter and rhythm to kind of craft a truth in a way that prose has more space to kind of run. What would you say, Matt?
In needing to tell a story in a very short amount of time, it has to be impressionistic. It has to be fragmented. It seems to me like a flash of lightning. You might not, you're only going to see it for a short amount of time, and it has to give you a very strong impression. So each word, if you're writing prose, every word might be worth $1. And if you're writing short fiction, every word might be a $10 bill. And if you're writing poetry, every word should be a $100 bill. And you need to be aware of that. Now, there are many different camps of poetry, and a very wide array of
Right.
poems that can be written, and some are considered prose poems, where it's really hard to tell what the line between prose and poetry is, and other ones are very minimalist, where each word is really $1,000 and everything in between.
I think of Dante's Inferno.
Or the Odyssey, right? These
Yeah,
epic
I mean,
poems
that
that go on
was
for
big.
hundreds and hundreds of pages, yes.
Matt has a poem in his book, it's called Long Poem, and it's got 3 lines. And it essentially says, you know, some of these people write these really long poems. I can't write poems like that.
Yeah.
I always thought poetry was the distillation of a truth down to its absolute essence, or something. I'm not doing him justice, but I think, you know, for poets like Matt and I, we don't do the long epic poem, and I do write some prose, so if I'm going to write prose, I want to write prose, and if I'm going to write poetry, I want it to be very tight. The lines
Right.
and the words have to be tight.
But that has to be a poetry form that you're talking about, because I'm thinking back to the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I'm thinking back Dante's Inferno, and I'm thinking that these were people who wrote, it's actually a lore, mythology, a history, and they wrote it in a form that could be sung.
Right.
And memorized.
read
The
and-
rhyming helps you memorize it and pass it down.
Because people couldn't
That's
read.
right.
Because
Right.
people
Right.
the
Right.
common person couldn't read, so maybe that was, and then I think in terms of rap,
Yeah,
and how easy rap is to remember
right.
because of the rhyming. So I
Yeah.
guess it's what you're trying to accomplish as well as the message.
Right. And there are different camps of poetry in terms of accessibility. There are poets who are purposefully obtuse, like they want you to kind of
No.
it's like breaking and entering, as Billy Collins calls it, breaking and entering. If you want to come into the house, you have to kind of break in the window to try to find your way in. There's other poets, which I think Matt and I try to be, which is we welcome you in the front door of our poem.
Hospitable
We're
poetry.
hospitable poetry. It doesn't mean it's not abstract. It just means we welcome the reader in. We're not saying we dare you to figure out what we mean. We want them to come away with something, and they don't have to come away with
That's
the
the
same
teacher
thing.
in you.
Right, well, I think we don't want them to come away with necessarily what I thought about when I wrote, but some feeling or thought that they can call
The
from
argument is that no one's going to want to finish a journey if they can't begin it. And so if they can't arrive at an entry point, it's very hard to expect them to finish the journey.
To continue.
Wherever it takes them. So the idea of a poem being hospitable, and one of the compliments we enjoy most from people who are at our readings or who've read our books is that they usually don't like poetry, but they enjoyed our work, and they call themselves poemophobes, or they're poemophobic.
I'm not poemophobic, but I guess I'm just very, if I listen to it, I think if it's a good poem, I'm going to take something from it, because I think I have a musical heart, even though I can't
Absolutely.
translate it into anything else. And I think also with all forms of writing, everyone takes something different away from it.
Absolutely.
Maybe not completely different, but because it's a combination of your personal experience. But I am, some poetry I just say, what are they talking about? So
Well, I think
that must be those break and enter people.
Yeah. I think
But there's also people who aren't very good at reading their own poems. So there's a performance ability that comes with reading. Some poems, if you had the book in front of you at the gazebo that night, you might have been able to get something more from it, or maybe you're more a visual person than auditory. So I would say to anybody who thinks they don't like poetry, if they've read it, maybe they need to hear it.
Yeah, I think they were good.
Shakespeare's meant to be,
They were all good.
Shakespeare's poetry, and it's meant to be
acted.
read and acted.
I would also say that, everyone says they like music, but if you ask them, do you like all forms of music, they would say no. And I think the same is true for poetry,
I think so, too.
is that there's, many spoken word artists or people who write poems that tell narratives and that go on and on are in a tradition of jazz. And if you fundamentally don't enjoy jazz, you might not like that poetry. And there are some poets who probably fashion their work in the style of a classical, composer, or others who think of it in terms of, rock or blues or something like that. And so to not like or like poetry is a complicated thing, you know, in the way that we like or don't like music. And so,
No, well, I would definitely not be a poemophobe. Because I think, just like music, I think I like almost all forms of music, something in them anyway, different pieces.
some, the more you learn about them, the more you can enjoy them.
I think so.
And that's certainly true.
And you know what I think is also true is when you learn about the person who wrote
Yes.
whatever it is, the music, the poetry,
Yep.
the prose, I think when you find out their story, there's a program on PBS that I love, Bill Moyer's Journal.
yes.
And he has people on, and when they talk about their works, and Charlie Rose too, it's like, wow.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
it gives
Yeah.
it the depth that
Yes.
you really need to appreciate it. So, anyway, Terri, tell us about your book, Overexposed.
Well, my book is a poetic memoir, so it's told in both poetry and prose. I think of it as, it's called Overexposed, I think of it as snapshots in my life. It's not told in a typical memoir form where it's very linear and in all prose. The story of my life, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and so I felt to be able to do justice to the experience of post-traumatic stress disorder and the experience of recovering memories, it couldn't come in linear form in the book. It had to be disjointed. It had to have some of the pieces, the poetry, be more distilled and tight, and other pieces be more expansive. So it is, I think of it as a box of snapshots of my life. If somebody were to open up a box that wasn't in an album in a linear form and pull pieces out, some of them might be a little bit more watermarked or faded.
Used.
Right, faded, but they all tell a piece. They're all a piece in the tapestry of reconstructing my life, gaining my voice back, and ultimately it's about hope and overcoming great obstacles, which I always think when I do keynote speaking, the takeaway is if I'm okay, what's holding you back in your own life that you think you can't overcome? So
Right, yeah. Would you like to read something?
I'd love to read something. I'm going to read one of the more hopeful poems of the book, which is called Rialto Beach, and it's for Rainer and Atticus, my sons. And it takes place on Washington State near the Pacific Ocean. We Long Islanders love the Atlantic, but there's something very different about the Pacific. And it was one of those moments where you felt like time is ephemeral, like you want to hold a second in your hand, but you know it's going. So, Rialto Beach. We walk the mist across broken shells whose inhabitants still cling to pearly walls, wet hearts out of casings, edges softened like memories with the rubbing of time. Spread across the gray expanse, mammoth bodies of red timber take shape, an eagle talon, a chiseled face, walking closer, the wide mouth of a lion, until we stand right in front of what is simply a felled tree, shape-shifting the way time loses its arc, toes gripping sand. Our almost 2-year-old draws long lines on the shore with a stick as our older son sings to the sea stacks, teetering on the edge of still, more driftwood, shifting into something wordless as the tide begins to rush in, erasing our every footstep, and the wind and waves beat, beat, beat on like the infinite.
It's beautiful. It captures
Thank you.
what it's like to be on a beach. With,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you.
excellent. Thank you. Let's put you back where we can see you.
Oh, good. Yes.
Okay, Matt, tell me about 1,000 Doors.
Well, it's in many ways a bit of an anthology. It represents about 17 years of writing, and finally I was able to put it all together. So in many ways it charts my recovery of, I guess, my own voice. I didn't have the same childhood that Terri did, but certainly there was a lot of dysfunction. As the younger child, I was in many ways kind of away in my room, listening, just trying to kind of leave my body and pretend that no one was yelling and arguing. And I think a lot of people have that experience to varying degrees. And so I discovered writing kind of in that process. And so there are many pieces in the book about my childhood, and also, I think, in reflection of my personality and what has always interested in me, kind of the intersection of the stark malevolence of the home and the world around us, and the kind of mysterious benevolence of the world as well, both in the home and around us, and how fine the line is between what is beautiful and what is painful. And so I think the work focuses on the small moments, the small details that are emblematic of the complexity that we can all relate to and connect to. And so the title, 1,000 Doors, puts it all together in that it refers to a Buddhist parable about a mustard seed. It's the famous mustard seed parable, where a woman, Kisa Gotami, has wanted to have a child for a very long time, and she has a child and is thrilled, and then a few weeks later is heartbroken when he dies. And she runs frantic through the streets, mourning and holding the child's body. And someone finally points her in the direction of the Buddha. And he says, "Look, I can help you." And she's so thankful, and he says, "You must go back to your town and find a mustard seed." And being India, she's thrilled because they're pretty ubiquitous. And he says, "But there's a catch," because with Buddha, there's always a catch, or else you don't learn anything. The mustard seed must be given to you by someone in a house that has not known loss or suffering. So she goes back to her town and starts knocking on doors. And behind each door, there is an eager, welcoming face who desperately wants to help this woman, but respectfully says they cannot because they've lost a sister or a brother or an uncle or a grandmother. And so she continues knocking on doors, say 1,000, and by the end of the night, she rests against a tree, and though she still feels sorrow, some of it is lifted, and she starts to understand what the Buddha was trying to teach her. And she goes back, and he says, "Hey, do you have my mustard seed?" And she says, "No, but I understand that no one is without suffering, no one is without pain, and I want to help others as you have helped me." And for me, not just the work that I try to do in my poems, but the purpose of art itself, and poetry and film and dance and theater, is to elevate the specific to the universal so that we can connect and help move past the line of desperation to healing and hope, and moving back into our own bodies, our own voices, and living out loud. And so that title, it kind of weaves in the parable and the work in the book.
So much modern poetry that I've listened to is about people overcoming terrible things that have happened to them, whatever they are, because they're different for different people. So would you like to read?
Sure.
Like,
I will read a love poem, and I'm going to do this because love poems are, I think, the hardest things to write, because the greater the emotion, the fewer words we have. And that's true for trauma, but it's also true for love. And
it's also a risk.
And there have been millions of love poems, so what else is there to say,
but
besides...
it's also a risk. You're risking those inner feelings.
Sure. So